Welcome back to Harmonize Your Life Conversations on Self-Care for Women of Color podcast with your host, Dr. Toni G. Alvarado. I'm so glad to have you in the podcast studio with us today. I'm super excited because this begins the month of March, begins our anniversary for our podcast series. We have now been in our podcast series now for 2 full years. And now this month launches us into year 3 of the Harmonize Your Life podcast. I'm so excited today about our conversation today, our conversation and dialogue partner. She is no stranger to this podcast. She is no stranger to our community. And I am so glad to have her back in the podcast studio with me as we kick off year 3 of the Harmonize Your Life podcast. We'll be right back in just a moment, right after this. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right. Welcome, Dr. Jeanne Porter King. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hello, Dr. Toni G. Alvarado. Thank you for having me again. Congratulations on going into your 3rd year, and happy Women's History Month.
Yes, Women's History Month. Mm-hmm. We launched this podcast 2 years ago on March 2nd, 2020. We did not know we would be in a global pandemic. We kind of, we started to hear about it right before the podcast launched. But little did we know that when we went full steam ahead with this podcast, that we would be in a global pandemic. Now, over 2 years, going into the 3rd year. But the Lord has been kind to us and has given us grace to host this podcast with just dynamic women like yourself coming in and talking to us about issues related to women of color, issues related to health, wellness, self-care, caregiving, you name it, mental health, relationships. We have run the gamut on this podcast, and I'm so grateful to God and to all of the women like yourself who have graced us. And this is your 2nd time with us in the podcast studio. And I'm so grateful that you had the time to come back and talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me back. It's always my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, for those of you who do not know Dr. Jeanne Porter King, I don't know why if you don't, but let me just explain to you who she is. She is a sister beloved, a colleague, a friend. She is an author, business leader, inspirational teacher, speaker, ministry leader, board certified coach. She brings her engaging style to audiences and draws on her faith and experiences in the marketplace and ministry to help her audiences connect to their purpose, authentic identity, and the power of leading from within. Dr. Jeanne shares inspiring messages that are both informative and transformative. She is the founder and president of the Transporter Group, a consulting practice specializing in leadership development and diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and training. Dr. Jeanne has developed global leadership programs and has trained and coached leaders in 20 different countries. She is passionate about coaching and developing existing and emerging leaders to be their best and to reach their highest aspirations. Dr. Jeanne received her both Bachelor and Master of Science degrees from the University, from Ohio State University, a Master of Arts in Theological Studies from McCormick Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Organizational Communication from Ohio University. She has over 30 years of consulting and training experience in various industries, including manufacturing, telecommunications, financial services, community groups, governmental agencies, churches, and other faith-based communities. She is authentic. She has a genuine concern for others to grow and develop, and she has dedicated her 30-year career to helping women tap into their purpose and destiny. Dr. Jeanne, will you just take a minute and greet our audience for a second while I let my husband, he is calling me because he just got back. This is real life. My son said, Mom, people want to see your real life. So don't be alarmed when real life happens. My dog is barking and my husband is outside because he just flew back in from flying his mother home. And I realized that I have his keys because I dropped him off at the airport. So he's calling me to let him in the house. All right. So take it for a minute and I'll be right back.
Okay? I sure will. I sure will.
Just talk to us a little bit. First of all, let me just say this. Dr. Jeanne, you brought me in on a writing project, Created to Thrive, this book. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So talk to us a little bit and introduce this project, and I'll be right back.
Okay, sounds good. That sounds good. This really is about real life. Well, our book is entitled Created to Thrive, and it's published by CBE International, which is a global women's advocacy group, a Christian global women's advocacy group. I sit on the board for this organization. And our aim is to promote gender justice throughout the world, in the home, at work, and especially in the church. This particular writing project was launched after a conference that we held in 2018, I believe it was, maybe 2019. And it was called Created to Thrive. And this particular book is intended to help churches develop spaces in which women can thrive. Men and women can lead together. And the book is really about cultivating abuse-free faith communities, that there are very subtle ways and often sometimes explicit ways in which abuse occurs in our churches, no matter how well-meaning the pastor is, the leadership team. Women can be very hurt and damaged in these spaces. So this book is about giving strategies to help women thrive and to create these abuse-free environments. The first section deals with domestic abuse. Many people don't really even know what domestic violence is. This particular section is opened up with an article or a chapter in which the person who's giving the foreword describes a particular church in the Midwest in which the leaders spoke for just 10 minutes about domestic violence. And one of the women on the committee was a psychologist, so she was the spokeswoman for this initiative. And the elders of the church were amazed at the number of women that called in afterwards, wrote in, that they didn't even realize that some of the experiences they had in their relationships were abusive. And so part of this book and this project is to raise awareness around abuse, as well as to provide prevention and intervention. One of the things that Dr. Toni and I were blessed to contribute were around the issues of leading and mentoring women in the church, because so much of abuse is about power and control. Yeah. So I see our chapters as putting the power back into the hands of women and reducing that abuse by raising up women in the church to lead and create those safe spaces.
Yeah. And I like what you said about power back in the hands of women. And what we're doing is because that's empowerment, right? And I'm all things women, all things empowering women, helping women understand the power of their voice, agency, self-agency, and just their leadership potential, and seeing them maximize and live that out. And then not only with women, but I think part of the whole empowerment part is educating and bringing awareness to those issues that that create barriers for women. Sometimes even educating our brothers along the lines of what they may be doing, sometimes subconsciously. They don't even know that they're doing as relates to disempowering or creating barriers for women. This is Women's History Month, and the national, and I always kind of look at what's the theme for the year, and so this year, the theme of Women's History Month is dismantling biases concerning women. And so just the whole mindset. I wanted to bring this book to the fore because this is Women's History Month. This is the anniversary of the podcast, and I thought this would be a great way to start out our next this month of conversations around women, health, wellness, and part of wellness and self-care, wholeness. Wholeness is helping women to break past barriers that have been societal impositions and the like that have been sometimes forced on us.
Definitely. And it's interesting. I did not realize that this year's Women's History Month theme was breaking biases.
And you talk about that in your.
I was going to say my chapter is called Breaking Down Barriers for Women in Leadership, and I deal with 4 levels of bias, 4 levels of barriers.
Can you talk about those?
I sure will. I start with what I call the personal level, and those are the barriers that exist in the minds and hearts of people that prevent women from moving forward. So it could be in the heart and mind of a woman herself, in which she's internalized bias against other women, against herself. Many women who have come to formation in patriarchal structures can internalize those messages that women aren't as good pastors, or women shouldn't be pastors, or women shouldn't be leaders, or, as they're in the workplace, oh, I can't stand working for a woman manager. They're just so difficult. So that's a personal level bias that's in the mindset. And men and women, I just started with a women's bias, but men who are in our churches, men who we work with, can hold those personal level biases also. And those biases can be unconscious or conscious. I tend to use the word implicit biases because there's associations that end up getting made between groups of people and certain words, certain associations, and they're implicit. I don't always call them unconscious, because unconscious bias really comes out of the psychological literature when we start thinking about cognitive biases and the ways that we think. And the Neural Leadership Institute, for instance, has cataloged over 150 cognitive biases, from confirmation bias to in-group, out-group bias. And it is a real thing around how our brains create these shortcuts or structures to be able to process information quickly. Our brains can take in millions and millions of data, but I often say our minds can't handle it. So we end up developing these heuristics or shortcuts. So there's this unconscious bias. I also look at the role of culture and the role of the broader society in creating some of the associations that are more learned, are not necessarily the shortcuts, but they've become stereotypes. For instance, for me, is a type of implicit bias. And so we have people who hold stereotypes about women. Yeah. Women are more emotional, so therefore they don't make good leaders. Or women are, women who are assertive and speak up. Yeah. They get stereotyped as the angry woman, and as Black women, we've heard that time and time again. Yeah. So those are the means and themes that exist in people's minds at that personal level. at the interpersonal level, what happens is those stereotypes or those biases emerge in the form of the actions that people exhibit towards women, or the words they use against women. We now call those microaggressions. But the reality is there's really nothing micro about them. Dr. Charles Pierce, who is a psychiatrist at Harvard, first introduced the term microaggressions in the 70s. And then Dr. Daryl Sue, he has cataloged a lot of these microaggressions. And the reality is, for gender, we'll take a look at that. Gender microaggressions are the nonverbal and verbal ways in which sexist or misogynist beliefs are communicated to women at that interpersonal level. Again, things that people say, the idea of having, certain labels for women, again, who lead. Sometimes they're coded like, oh, she's so strident. That's a word for, she's talking, she's standing up for herself too much, Yeah. Then there's also organizational level barriers or biases. Those get encoded in the practices and policies. So in the corporate arena, it shows up in policies that prevent women from breaking the glass ceiling. Sheryl Sandberg in her book, I don't necessarily always ascribe to that book, Lean In, because, Black women been leaning in for a long time. But she did bring up something that always caught my attention, that in performance reviews and in talent review meetings, you'd have a man and a woman who were up for a similar position. The man was assumed ready for the next level, even if he had not demonstrated his competence for that next level. The woman had to prove her competence. Wow. That's that practice that in leaders in those organizations, whether they realized it or not, that was a practice they held to. And then sometimes it gets inscribed in our policies. And then final one, I'll stop talking after this. It comes out in our culture or at the social level, in language, using sexist language or non-gender inclusive language. I still can't believe this is 2022 and we're still talking about male men, or we're still talking about mankind. Every time I hear a newscaster say mankind, it just irks me. Yeah. But it's that at that cultural, societal level that we still have those sexist patterns.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So in here you list, in the book you list these gender microaggressions and how they show up. Mm-hmm. One of the ones that really stood out to me is the invisibility, the things, the microaggression that women's accomplishments get overlooked.
Yeah. And in many ways, women get overlooked. Again, we won't limit it to the church, but we'll start there. My next chapter deals with how to start recognizing the gifts in women, because in some places, our gifts just get overlooked. They're invisible. I share this in my upcoming book. I was at I don't even remember what it was, a conference. But the leaders were predominantly men. And I didn't know much about this particular organization at the time. But, one of the leaders got up and just boasted that, we are the largest, organization of this nature led by Black men. And he boasted that. And I looked in the audience, first of all, I was like, those dogs with the dog whistle, their ears perk up. I'm thinking, am I the only one who heard that? Did nobody hear that but me? And so that was a statement in many ways that really spoke of keeping women in that organization invisible. Their contributions didn't matter. This group is run by men, and we're boasting about it. So, invisibility.
The biggest supporters are probably women.
Exactly. That's what I would say.
Yeah, because I'm sure
looking around, the majority of
you looked around the audience, you looked in the room, it was probably more women there than men.
Yes,
But
yes.
but you know, so when we talk about breaking these barriers, you talked about at the institutional level, at the you talked about language barriers, intersectional barriers, societal, cultural level. So when you say here, you have a section, you say, envision the future without barriers. So
Yeah.
envision for women that are listening, for maybe even men that are listening, what would our future look like? This is Women's History Month. This podcast is about empowering women, particularly women of color. If we were to envision a place where women didn't have these barriers to overcome, sexist language, restrictive gender roles, um, denial of individual sexism. I like this when you said denial of individual sexism occurs when church leaders denied their sexism. For instance, church boards, church communities claimed they could not find a qualified. Now, let me tell you one that irks me. That irks you is God is only using a woman because he couldn't find a man.
Yeah.
Like
that's in the next. Yes. Yes.
I'm like, what is it that God can't find? First of all, God created. So why would God need to make a substitute?
Right.
Okay. So that's one of my pet peeves. But all these things, invisibility, sexist humor or jokes, things of that nature. So how can we envision, what can women do? What can churches do? What can organizations do to make it a more equitable environment for women?
You know, I was really challenged with that piece about envisioning the future without these barriers. And I tell the story, it was finishing up a symposium at seminary that I was actually just attending, but the guest lecturer, I got some chance to spend some time with him later. And he challenged, he said, envision what leadership or what your organization, your space would look like if you fully lived into the vision of the kingdom of God. And that's where I would want to start with, is that as we look truly at the kingdom of God, or the kingdom, some call it, the realm of God, we know according to Galatians 3:28 that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female, there's neither bond nor free. So as we begin to stand on that vision of an inclusive space for men and women, as we begin to look at, even in the Revelation, we get a little bit of glimpses of the people, men and women of every tribe and tongue that knelt or bowed before the throne. We begin to see the heart of God really is about this very multicultural, cross-gender leadership. So that's the place I believe we start with, is really envisioning God's heart for this. And then beginning to look at, in our individual spaces, what are the ways we can create that? See, I believe it starts at the micro level as well as the macro level. So we're beginning to see more changes at, the Senate, the Congress. The Vice President of the United States now is a Black woman or a woman of color of Indian descent. We see it in different nations, but each of us has a sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And if we can begin to carve out and create and use our influence to create these inclusive leadership models, starting with us, I think that's where we start. That we watch our own language, we mentor the next generation, we with intentionality, we bring women and men on board. We seek allies and we become allies. And, I believe there's men, when I think about, do you remember Dolores Williams in Sisters in the Wilderness, her womanist anthology, not anthology, but book. And I used that in a paper once, and actually in my second book. And she said, when the daughters of Zelophehad took their issue to Moses, it was the whole idea of, we don't get to inherit land because our father had no sons. said that's not fair. They took it to Moses. And I quoted this in my second book. Dr. Williams says, and Moses took it to God. And the moment Moses took it to God, it became a theological issue. And Moses came back and said, the daughters have well spoken, have rightly spoken. Yeah. And that we've got to start taking this to God. We've got to speak up as advocates. We've got to, and what I said in there is we've got to also identify, there's some Moseses out there that are allies that support women's egalitarianism and women's inclusion. And we've got to continue to move forward because there's going to be noise in the background. But whether it's in our church, whether it's in our corporations or companies, this is the work I do, you know, so helping to raise up senior level women in the organization, coaching women to find their voice and trying to break down those barriers that have been erected. This is what we have to do. And some of us are called to do it. One other quick thing. I remember, and you know my background, I'm in ministry, you know, you read that. But for years, I often felt a little badly that I wasn't in full-time ministry as some of my colleagues were. Wow. And when I got out of seminary, there was no placement. So I launched my business again. I'd been a consultant, and God opened up so many doors that I, in my work as coach, consultant, working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially for women's equality and equity, one day it hit me that I really believe the Spirit spoke to me and said, wherever you're tearing down gender barriers or fighting against patriarchy, that's kingdom work. And it's not all done in the four walls of the church. And in many ways, some of our churches are so backward still around women that, you know, the work wherever we are is the work of the kingdom.
Wow. Wow. And it's still ministry. And you have helped me. You know, we talked about this on a personal level. You helped me with that. And you helped me to expand. Part of this podcast was my way of another way of doing ministry, another way of empowering women and helping women find their voice and speak their voice and be all that God has called them to be. So when we talk about, because this podcast, when we're talking today about the book Created to Thrive, if you're just listening, Dr. Jeanne Porter King and I are part of this book. She wrote 2 chapters in the book. I wrote a chapter in the book. I wrote a chapter on coaching women. Her first chapter is entitled Breaking Barriers for Women. Her second chapter is entitled Women's Ways of Leading in the Church. And if you know anything about Dr. Jeanne Porter's work, her book, Leading Ladies, there's biblical images of women's leadership. I used that book for years, Dr. Jeanne, in my when I was teaching gender differences in leadership at at Beulah Heights University years ago, and then we used it in our Sunday school at church and with women's school at church, and then of course, you know, we've used your work with My Sister's Keeper Foundation. We've used your Influence Begins with I. And so we love your work. The chapter that I wrote in this book, you all, is Strategies for Coaching Women in Ministerial Leadership. And so, but we're talking, not all the women who are listening to this podcast or watching us on YouTube are in quote unquote ministry space, but these happen in our families. This happens. This whole biases and gender barriers for women exist in our families, exist in our churches, exist in our corporate settings, in our work, in our society in general, in politics, in every arena, in every education, in every arena, even in media. We see it in sport. My goodness. Well, I mean, last year, so many women of color came under public ridicule and just bullying in the public, all because they took their own bodies, their agency, and spoke for when they were tired and when they weren't Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka and all those. And so this idea of Created to Thrive and breaking barriers and helping women. Let me transition a little bit. Why would that be important? You and I are both in the space of being concerned about wellness and wholeness for women, particularly for women, but for our community in general. How does this relate to your whole breaking barriers, whole, helping women understand their voice, helping our culture break down barriers? How does this relate to wellness and self-care, helping for women?
Awesome question. You know, you're the self-care guru, but making that connection is very important, because first of all, when you look at wellness models, as you well know, the whole, for instance, the Global Wellness Institutes defines wellness as these intentional practices towards the holistic, holistic approach to your body. They identify anywhere between 6, 9, or 12 dimensions of our lives that are important to our overall well-being. So wellness being kind of these practices, well-being being the outcome. And if you're leading and hitting the wall and barriers, it's affecting you in a number of ways, and it's diminishing your well-being, our well-being, and it's not allowing us to flourish or to thrive. And so one of the things that I looked at, or the ways in which, my next book is called Leading Well. I looked at some of these wellness models, and for Black women, I think there's a couple that don't get mentioned. And I've heard you say this, but I believe it firmly. Typically in these 6, 9, or 12 dimensions of wellness, spirituality is one of the 6, 9, or 12. For Black women of faith, especially, spirituality has to be the core, that we draw from that well of the spirit to enhance our overall well-being. But because we face a lot of biases, because we face those gender stereotypes or those intersectional biases as Black women, both race and gender, I'm a firm believer that part of our wellness and our well-being has to also be in a wellness approach to our very identity, our personal identity. We have got to be strongly, number one, anchored in that we are created in the image of God. And we are gifted by God, right? And we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And so the broader culture has gotten a little better. There's still a European beauty aesthetic. You and I are wearing our hair natural now. But there was a time, as a matter of fact, it just came across, I haven't looked at it yet, but it just came across my email. NPR apparently did a piece, it was the BBC, did a piece of why Black women in the US are still penalized for wearing our natural hair, even with the Crown Act. See, that is fundamental to who we are. I remember when I was going natural, I felt this need, one of my clients was about 75% of my revenue, and it was pretty substantial. And I remember talking with that client, even though we were doing diversity, I prepared her to know I'm going natural. And I never, and sometimes we think, the Black community, we got it, we have to teach the white community and, maybe even some other communities. But one of the biggest resistance I got was from our own community. I remember my esthetician who did my brows at the time. I began to have this conversation with her, and I'm lying there, she's working on my brows. And she said, those young women with that natural hair, it's just a hot mess. And, so I continue, I'm going to do it. And, she thinks it's for younger people. I was a woman of age at the time. And finally, she just said, girl, listen, don't lose your business over hair. And I thought to myself, wow. We still have those mindsets. But my point is
those biases and
it diminishes our well-being and how we see ourselves. And we can't show up as confidently when we're putting on a mask and presenting. It's not even our authentic self. Girl, I feel so free with my locks now.
Girl, I'm telling you, I love my natural hair. I'm never going back.
And this is the what I tell people, so you can do it too. This is the face of a Black woman professional.
Come on.
There's many, but yes, right now I have the locks twisted up. But yeah, this is the face. We are setting the pace. We are carving out the field for the image of a Black professional. And the point is, we're not monolithic.
No,
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not even going to be one of.
Don't subscribe to that, or you don't want to do that's fine.
Exactly.
But it can be both and. Exactly. It doesn't have to be either or.
That's what I was just getting ready to say. If you still want to straighten, that's fine. You want to weave, you want to shave it off. But the point is, we should
whatever it is, it's okay, and it's not abnormal. It's not unprofessional. Exactly. Right. Exactly. So we can normalize natural hair.
Exactly.
They say, can we normalize? Well, let's normalize, the things that make us who we are. And so I think that's so important when we talk about, that's what this book was about for me. Created to Thrive was helping women understand who you are and who God created you to be, and helping culture understand our church community, our churches, our corporate community, our family understand, so that we're not putting women in bondage, that we're making them free to be who God created them to be. I love talking to you. We could talk all day.
And the thing where they asked us to do, and I'm so glad you joined me in this endeavor, they gave us that section, but it's abusive. They talked about domestic violence. They talked about physical, emotional abuse, but I think it's abusive to the very image of God within women, to hinder them from reaching their full potential and living out their purpose. That's another type of abuse. To say women, I share a story in one of the chapters when my first book, Leading Ladies, that you talked about, that was in 2000. We're talking 20 something years ago, not too long after I'd gotten out of graduate school. And one of the radio hosts from the Chicago area, pretty well-known one, invited me on for an interview. And actually it was a TV interview. So he must have had like a TV show. And lo and behold, instead of just talking about the book, at one point he says, should women be pastors? I wasn't in a pastoral role yet, but my grandmother was. Girl, I grew up with a woman pastor, right? So I just looked at him and said, women are pastors. Wait a minute now. Should women be pastors? He was trying to bait me. And, I again emphasize women are pastors. That's not a question. Women are already pastors. And
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
it reminds me of when I went to seminary. My first seminary experience, I took a class called pastoral ministry, and the school was predominantly white, evangelical, and the pastor said to me, the professor said to me in the class, I'm one of two women in the class, and I think I was the only woman of color. There's two women in the class. I'm the only, maybe two of people were color. One was me, and I'm Black. So I got a double bind theory going on here. I'm Black and I'm a female, right? And he says to me in front of the whole class, well, Toni, when I reference pastor, I always use the pronoun he, because I don't really believe in women pastors. He said this to me in front of the whole class. And you know what I said to him?
What did you say?
I'm not here because of what you believe. I'm here because of what I believe. If you rate me fairly, we won't have any issues.
Amen.
And I got to get out of the pastoral ministry class.
Amen. You got out of it?
An A out of the pastoral ministry class. Because see, here's the thing. And this is why when you said, when the radio announcer asked you, should women be pastors? I don't even enter into those conversations anymore. It's like, I'm not going to talk about whether or not women are called to preach, women are called to pastor.
We're doing it.
We're doing it.
Right. That's what my point was. We're doing it. And we're doing it under the unction and call of God. that this is not a man call or we're doing something to please you. We felt the call of God in our spirit. And are you to suggest that, you know, God limits God's call to one gender? No, that's your limited thinking, not our God. No, God uses and chooses whom God will.
And listen, it reminds me of the text. You know the text in the Gospels, when Jesus goes and visits John the Baptist in prison, and are you the one, or
should we look for another?
Jesus said, "The blind see and the lame are walking."
Go tell John that.
You know what I'm saying? So, hey, the proof is in the pudding, and so doing the work, and God's hand is on our lives, and not just our lives, but our brothers as well. And I think visioning the future is when we can all see that together and exist together, and know that my gift is just as vital as his gift, and his gift is just as vital as my gift, and we don't have to diminish one for the other, and we can coexist and do this thing the way God designed it.
Amen. Amen.
In the beginning, it was not so. It was not so. He created.
And what I appreciate what you're doing, especially in this podcast, like when you just shared how you handled that comment. You know, and you're a coach. You know, we both do coaching, but you're a coach that you model and you help bring out the best. I think that's you asked earlier, how can we vision this space? Part of it is to do what we do for the next generation. There's some bad sisters coming behind us who have not even thought about the barriers the way that we've done. They've just not been hindrances to them. As you said, we're not even debating this anymore, but we've got to continue to coach, support, lead together. And it is men and women leading together.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeanne Porter. Porter King, let me give everybody some information on how they can find you, and tell us about some of the great, you got a new book coming out.
I do. We just announced it on, was it yesterday or the day before? It's Leading Well. Baker Books picked it up. I'm so grateful. My agent is she's the best. And it is looking at, it's a reread of a very vital woman in scripture that provides a leadership model for us, that intertwines her biblical story along with her post-biblical story that we see her coming up in church history. And she provides a wonderful platform to talk about what I call outsider women, because many ways we as Black women especially still lead from the outside. We're not fully included in corporations, in our churches even, that are still pretty male dominated. There's exceptions. We create spaces. I'm grateful that you're co-pastor along with your husband. I'm executive pastor along with mine, but everyone doesn't have it quite like that. And so we have these wonderful lessons that come out of the woman at the well, and there's a play on it, because I really believe as Christian women, we have to lead from the well. And in so doing, you know, it helps our well-being. So I developed a little model of wellness that is, you know, again, when I looked at some of the models, they miss some of the things that I think were vital for us as Black women. Another is being able to draw from our culture, that some of our well-being is enhanced from our culture. There's some things in the culture that are still very, you know, patriarchal, yes, but there our music, our church traditions, not all churches, but you get the point. So I can't wait for it to be birthed into the earth realm. And because
we'll bring you back on the podcast to talk about it again.
Please. It centers Black women. So it centers my experience as a Black woman, and it's for other Black women, though I know others will read it. I want others to read it, but they need to listen to us. Listen.
We have something to say.
We have some experiences.
We have some experiences. And, you know, Jeanne, when I started this podcast, I went back and forth with whether or not to target my conversation toward women of color. I thought, and I went back and forth, and I even asked a few people, should I conversations on self-care and just make it open? Conversations on women or conversations on self, but what was in my heart was conversations on self-care for women of color. And I had to wrestle with whether or not, okay, Lord, am I leaving out a group of people or whatever? But no, this doesn't mean that we can't have the conversation with others. But I think that the conversations that other communities have been having some of these conversations, and it's okay for us to target some of our conversations toward our community and uplift, raise consciousness, uplift our community, and have safe spaces for us to have conversations. Not that we're shutting anyone else out, but if you want to come in, let's talk. But
I coach women of all ethnicities. I just had a great success with, a Taiwanese female woman pastor. I have European American. I coach across the board, and my corporate work is diversity, equity, inclusion. But I promised myself when I got to a place, I wanted to also do some things for us, because often we're missing from some of the leadership conversations, what I call the leadership discourse. It's changing, but sometimes we're missing. And there's sometimes at those senior levels that I worked at, I didn't see a lot of women that looked like me. And as a lot of times, it's the 20 years I've been doing this work, a lot of times, a lot of the equity work around, gender equity, it benefited white women more than Black and brown women.
Wow.
And we've got to continue to share and create those space where we're helping women of color.
Wow.
So it does not, it's a both and, to your point earlier, it's a both and for all of us. So these conversations are safe spaces, but doesn't mean we don't do the work in other arenas also.
Well, I'm so excited. I mean, you touched on so many things. This is Women's History Month, the month of March. We're getting ready. In our local church, we're having International Women's Day on the third Sunday in March. And our speaker this year is Dr. Valerie Bridgman. And I can't wait for her to get here and minister. And it's so funny because you mentioned the daughters of Zelophehad.
Zelophehad,
and that's our theme this year. Reclaiming our inheritance and our voice. And so I know she's going to do a dynamic job with that.
Oh yeah.
Especially because she's a Hebrew scholar, Old Testament scholar. So
oh yeah.
Really, really good with that text. But thank you for this conversation. Thank you for helping me kick off year 3 as we go into the third year.
It's my honor.
Podcast. It's been a lot of work to keep it going, but God has given us grace to continue. I had someone say to me recently, it takes a lot to keep a podcast going
it does.
a long time. And so
it does. Kudos to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a team effort. My children got me involved in this, and they push me and they work with me and keep me going. And they, the young people, they like, Ma, you need to do this, you need to do that. Yeah. It's good to have those young people around you, because we're coaching them, they're coaching us.
They're coaching us. It's mutual. I got your email. I got the email from your daughter, who is at my alma mater, the Ohio State University.
Ohio State,
yeah. Yeah. So it's a mutual reciprocal relationship. I love keeping young women. I did a mentoring brunch today with one of our young people at our church. She's graduating this spring with a master's in her social work, MSW. And she just, just asking her questions. We're coaches. We ask questions. How are you doing? And I just love these deep conversations. I love listening to you and encouraging you. So yes, that's what we do.
Yes. Well, Dr. Jeanne Porter King has been our guest today. I have her website up on the screen for those of you that are listening and not watching us on YouTube. Go to Dr. Jeanne, Jeanne, JeannePorterKing.com. You can find her there on her website. On Facebook, she is Jeanne Porter King. On Instagram, you'll find her there at Dr. Jeanne Porter, at Dr. Jeanne Porter King. And on Twitter, you'll find her at Dr. Jeanne PK. And so I'm so glad to have her with us today. So glad that she has been our dialogue partner. You are listening to the Harmonize Your Life Conversations on Self-Care for Women of Color podcast. I am your gracious host, Dr. Toni Alvarado. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Google, Spotify. You can find us on Anchor Podcasts and the lightatl.live internet radio. I want to also invite you women to join the Harmonize Your Life Women's Self-Care Network. We have a network of women from all over the country. And we even, Dr. Jeanne, we have one of our members is actually in Germany. And we're reaching outside of the United States with our self-care network. And so we have members all over the country that are concerned about health, wellness, fitness, the whole gamut, the holistic approach to life, spirituality, our finances, our relationships, our leadership, all those aspects of what it means to be who God has called us to be. Go to my YouTube channel at Dr. Toni G. Alvarado. If you've not already subscribed, go there, subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can share these conversations when you go there. The link, you know how you do with YouTube. Share those videos that are up there. We have 3 years worth. We're going into 3 years, two full years of podcast episodes there. And we're going into our 3rd year of this podcast, beginning with this episode. So thank you for being here with us. And we look forward to more conversations with Dr. Jeanne Porter King. As when that new book comes out, we're going to bring her back and let her talk to us about leading well. And so we're excited about that. I love the partnership and the sisterhood. She stretched me in the area of writing and publishing, and I appreciate her for that. That's what we do, right? We live.
That's what we do. Yeah. We do. We support. And Dr. Toni, you had a marvelous blog article for us this month on self-care strategies for caregivers. And, thank you so much. They were just right on point. So I appreciate you writing whenever I ask you, join me in this. So thank you.
I appreciate that. The Bible says iron sharpens iron. And, I have to just, in a moment of transparency, my writing, when I went to seminary and particularly when I was working on my doctorate, that was the thing I was most insecure about. Lord, can I write a dissertation? Can I write a thesis? And so I always get a little anxiety whenever I write. And so when you asked me to be a part of these things, you're really helping me break that barrier of anxiety concerning writing. So thank you again. I appreciate you so much. All right. We'll see you all next week for another intriguing conversation on Harmonize Your Life, Conversations on Self-Care for Women of Color podcast with your host, Dr. Toni G. Alvarado. See you soon. Hi, this is Dr. Toni Alvarado, and I want to personally invite you to join the Harmonize Your Life Women's Self-Care Network. Join us for fitness motivation, health and wellness information, inspiration, self-care strategies, and ideas for creating harmony in your life. As a certified health and wellness coach, it is one of my greatest honors to support women in their fitness, health, wellness, and self-care goals. Join the Harmonize Your Life Women's Self-Care Network, and we will do good on your journey.